very right to be human is denied every day to hundreds of millions of people.
Dans ce temple des Nations Unies, nous sommes les gardiens d'un idéal. Nous sommes les gardiens d'une conscience. La lourde responsabilité et l'immense honneur qui sont les nôtres doivent nous conduire à donner la priorité au désarmement dans la paix.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
Chaque génération, sans doute, se croit vouée à refaire le monde. La mienne sait pourtant qu'elle ne le refera pas. Mais sa tâche est peut-être plus grande. Elle consiste à empêcher que le monde se défasse.
So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our third day of the Masterclass Global Actors for Peace Beyond the West and the Rest, and that we already triggered some debates with this provocative title in the past days. And it's today a great pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Richard Kaplan with us. Professor Kaplan is Professor of International Relations and a Fellow of the Linacre College at the University of Oxford. His principal areas of investigation and research interest are concerned with international organization and conflict management. So I could not imagine a better speaker for this masterclass, having in his research a particular focus on peacekeeping, post-conflict, and state building. So in this area, Professor Kaplan published a lot, several volumes and edited volumes. Let me just remember some of the most recent one, like International Governance of War-Torn Territories, Rule and Reconstruction, Exit Strategies and State Building, and his most recent book, Measuring Peace, Principles, Practices, and Politics, all published with Oxford University Press. And of course, the title of this book recalls the title of today's lecture, and we are particularly curious to know more about the study and research of Professor Kaplan. So thank you very much for being with us today, and we really want to know how is it possible to measure peace. Professor Kaplan, thanks a lot for being with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I'm just going to share my screen so that I can, give me a moment. Oh, okay, I hope that you can see the screen, and I hope that nothing is obstructing the view. So, as I said, really great pleasure to be with you today. You may be aware yesterday was the International Day of Peace. I don't know how many people are aware of that. So perhaps it's appropriate that today we're talking about peace and measuring peace stability. And as Valentina has just mentioned, I've published recently a book that is very closely related to the talk that I'll be giving today. You see here the cover of it, Measuring Peace, Principles, Practices, and Politics with Oxford University Press. So I can only say in a very self-interested way that if you have any further questions, which I'm unable to answer in the space of time that's available today, I naturally encourage you to purchase the book, which is now available at an affordable paperback price from Amazon and from Oxford University Press. But anyway, enough advertising on my part. So I'll give you an outline of the talk. I want to be able to see it myself. I'll first talk about the key question, the question at the heart of both my book and today's lecture and the importance of it. I'll talk a little bit about the difficulties of measuring peace, why, as important though it isn't something that we are able to do easily. I'll talk about what organizations do, and they often don't assess peace stability, but they do other things that are related to the assessment of peace stability. But there are some notable exceptions, some good practices, and I want to talk about those as well. So it's not all bad news. I also want to explore with you some of the issues that arise in the context of assessing the stability of peace, and then identify some of the principles of good practice. And then I'll end with some concluding remarks before we open up the floor to questions and comments from you. So just before I start, I thought it might be useful to provide you with an overview of armed conflict trends. Many of you may have seen this chart before, produced annually by the Uppsala University and the Conflict Data Program in conjunction with PRIO in Norway. And it shows the different types of conflict going back to 1946 until last year. 4 different types, actually. One that has pretty much disappeared: extra-state or really colonial wars. Interstate or classic wars between states. Internationalized intrastate wars are civil wars that have significant international involvement. So Syria today would be a good example of that. And then by far the largest number, and sadly growing, are intrastate wars or civil wars. And those are now at an all-time high since actually the end of the Second World War. After what looked like a downward trend in the aftermath of the Cold War, we've seen growing incidents of civil war. So it's useful to have this in the back of your mind. But the question that I want to explore with you today is the following one. How do we know that the peace that's been established following a civil war is a stable peace? And by stable, I mean not prone to relapse, not prone to recurrence. Now, peace stability is one dimension only of quality peace. It's not the only dimension, and I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later in my talk, but it is an important dimension. Willy Brandt, the former chancellor of West Germany, when it was West Germany, once famously said, "Peace is not everything, but without peace, everything is nothing." Now, of course, this was against the backdrop of the nuclearized Cold War, when the absence of peace was tantamount to the obliteration of on a global scale. So it was a different context, but nevertheless, the point about the importance of peace stability remains valid, as anyone who has witnessed directly or indirectly the ravages of war can tell you. Peace stability shouldn't be taken for granted. Conflict-affected countries are particularly vulnerable to conflict relapse, as you're going to see in this table. Now, let me explain what's going on here. But that Kaplan, by the way, is not me. So it's not a typo. But what I've done here with my colleague, Anke Heffler, in Konstanz University, is that we've looked at all internal conflicts, that is, all civil wars that ended after 1990 until 2013. And we looked at how long the peace endured after those civil wars ended. Now, for purposes of this analysis, the start of a peace period or a peace spell is marked by the end of the armed conflict, and whether that peace is established by military victory, outright military victory, like we've seen, for instance, in Sri Lanka, or a ceasefire, which is very common, a peace agreement, or simply the fizzling out of the armed conflict, which very often occurs as well. The important thing is that the peace has to have lasted for at least a year to count as a peace spell. Now, in the period that we observed from 1990 to 2013, there were 210 peace spells. That is 210 conflict periods, conflict episodes ended in peace that lasted for at least a year. Now, just to be clear, these aren't 210 separate conflicts. A single conflict can go hot and cold. It can stop and start. It can have multiple conflict episodes and multiple peace spells. This chart that you're looking at depicts how many peace spells break down and when this happens. So it shows, in other words, how long peace survives as measured in days. In the beginning, as you'd expect, all our observations are at peace. After 2 years, 99% of all peace spells survive. So only 1% of all peace spells have failed and armed conflict has recurred. After 3 years, 83% of the peace spells have survived. But after 12 years, that's 4,380 days precisely, after 12 years, only about half of the peace spells have survived. Now, that's a very high rate of peace failure or conflict recidivism. We use both terms. Indeed, if you extend the timeline and also the focus, not on peace spells, but on conflict-affected countries, you get another uncomfortable statistic. Between 1946, so the end of World War II, and 2013, 105 countries experienced civil wars. And of these 105 countries, more than half of them, 59 countries, experienced a relapse into violent conflict, in some cases more than once, after peace had been established. So that's another reason why peace stability matters, because there is a high rate of conflict relapse or conflict recidivism. Now, another reason why peace stability matters is because of the cost of peacekeeping and peace building. And what you see here is the cost of UN peacekeeping, the peacekeeping expenditure from 1950 to 2013. The approved budget for UN peacekeeping for the current fiscal year, which ends on 30th of June, 2022, and is a little lower than what you see here. It's about, well, precisely 6.38 billion US dollars, but it's still quite significant. Now, bear in mind that what you're seeing here is expenditure for UN peacekeeping only. It doesn't include all the other UN peace consolidation efforts, peace building, development in support of peace consolidation, nor the costs associated with the efforts of other organizations, whether they're governmental or non-governmental. And there are quite a few of those. Indeed, here, you can see additionally the number of regional peace operations, the number of peace operations that have been conducted by regional organizations since 1946. So these are non-UN peace operations in the period from, as I said, 46 to 2013. Now, regional organizations, especially in Africa and Europe, have been taking on more and more responsibility for peacekeeping and peace consolidation. And of course, those come at very considerable expense as well. So peace operation expenditure is another reason why peace stability matters. It's costly to restore peace when it has collapsed. The conflict recidivism or conflict relapse is the main reason why the UN Peacebuilding Commission, the PBC, was established at the World Summit back in 2005. The same summit, by the way, at which the norm of responsibility to protect was adopted. At that same meeting of heads of state, they agreed upon the establishment of a new entity, the newest kid on the block, if you will, at the UN Peacebuilding Commission. And the member states that approved the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission did so, and I'm quoting from the document that they adopted at the end of that summit, they did so, quote, recognizing the need for a dedicated institutional mechanism to address the special needs, I'm underlining special needs, of countries emerging from conflict towards recovery, reintegration, and reconstruction. Now, special needs refers to the fragility of the peace in countries emerging from armed conflict, as you saw in the earlier slide. And there's a tendency, there has been a tendency anyway, for countries to kind of fall off the radar of the international community in that critical early post-conflict years. Countries in conflict get a lot of attention sometimes they don't. But once the fighting has ended and you're in this early, very, very delicate post-conflict period, there is a tendency for countries to lose interest, frankly, the international community to lose interest. And that's where it's absolutely critical, as we saw, to make an effort to consolidate the peace. And that's why that was the rationale for the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission. But there's a question here for the Peacebuilding Commission. This, by the way, are the 6 countries that are currently on the agenda of the Commission. When do those countries graduate? When should a country come off the PBC's agenda? And that's a real challenge for the PBC today. This is not an academic question. It is a genuine practical concern for the Peacebuilding Commission. How do they know when it is appropriate for a country to come off the agenda? And the answer is contained actually in the resolution that established the PBC. And this is an excerpt from that Security Council resolution. And I'll read it. It says, the Commission shall terminate its consideration of a country-specific situation when foundations for sustainable peace and development are established, or upon the request of national authorities of the country under consideration. Okay, so the latter part is pretty clear. If the country under consideration requests to come off the agenda, the United Nations has to comply. But the first part is less clear. When foundations for sustainable peace and development are established, that language only begs the question, because what are the foundations for sustainable peace and development? That's what we need to know. And the problem fundamentally is that there are no hard measures or indicators of a consolidated peace, in contrast, say, to the indicators of a prosperous economy, notably certain macroeconomic fundamentals or a healthy population, for example, immunization rates or literacy rates, education rates, even though some of those can be contentious. We know that prosperity, economic prosperity as a function of gross domestic product is rather misleading because it masks inequalities. But nonetheless, there are some fairly good indicators of economic prosperity, of public health. But we don't have good indicators of peace stability. Now, what about the absence of armed conflict? Isn't that an indicator of a stable peace? It is certainly symptomatic of a stable peace, but it's not in itself an indicator of a stable peace. It doesn't tell us if the conditions are in place to ensure the survival of peace. The ultimate test of a stable peace, in cases where third parties have intervened, like peacekeepers, necessarily comes after the fact. That is, only when the international community has drawn down significantly and exited. That's when we really know whether a peace can survive. Even just a small token international military presence can buoy a peace artificially. So the presence of UN peacekeeping forces in Liberia in 1997, for instance, helped to keep the peace there, but it also gave rise to a mistaken impression of the rootedness, of the robustness of that peace, which the resumption of civil war 2 years later, less than 2 years later actually, would dispel. Now, one measure of the sustainability of peace that's commonly employed is the survival of a peace following the first election after peacekeeping forces have departed. But while this is arguably a reasonable measure, it's obviously not a practical one, because third parties naturally want to know that a peace is stable before they exit. So how do we know if a peace is a stable peace? And there are various ways one might approach the question. One way is to determine whether the factors that are known by scholars to be responsible for the onset, for the initiation of civil war are present. And if they are, then we have reason to be cautious about how stable a peace is. So scholars have identified three broad classes of causes of conflict onset, of conflict initiation. The first is motivation. Motivation encompasses a wide range of often grievance-based subfactors that might include relative deprivation, whether one group feels that it's being denied benefits or resources that another group has. Similarly, horizontal inequalities, ethnic insecurity, if an ethnic group feels that its security is at risk. So these are, if you will, motivational factors. And as I said, we can establish whether those are present in a continue to be salient in a post-conflict situation. The next set of causes that scholars have identified is feasibility. And this stresses the importance of opportunity over motivation, suggesting that rebellion's more likely where material conditions favor it, notably where the terrain is mountainous, allowing rebels to hide, where valuable natural resources are plentiful, allowing rebels to finance their activities from trade. You'll all be familiar with the concept of conflict diamonds, and also where there's external support for the rebels. The third cause of conflict onset that scholars often talk about is resilience and the lack of resilience. And this emphasizes the vulnerability of the state to various internal and external pressures. They might be, for instance, rising food prices or refugee flows, and the capacity of states and their institutions to cope effectively with these pressures, whether they can resist the pressures that, if they cannot, might lead to the resumption of war. Now, these factors are not necessarily mutually exclusive. A number of explanations for the outbreak of civil war combine several of these factors. Okay, so this, as I said, is one way, if you will, of answering the question, is the peace a stable peace, is to see whether any of these known causes of conflict are present or salient in this post-conflict situation, in the case in the country in question. But there are two problems with this approach. First, there is no consensus among scholars as to which of these factors matter or matter most. Indeed, as one scholar, Charles Call, has observed in a book that I strongly recommend to you, Why Peace Fails, what he says, and now I'm quoting, there is tremendous disparity among scholars about whether certain factors are important or not, and about the degree to which they're important. So that's one problem, lack of consensus among scholars. The second problem is that this approach assumes that the causes of conflict onset, of conflict initiation, and the causes of conflict recurrence are one and the same. Now, Call in his book has done some very interesting quantitative analysis, and it shows that the two do share certain risk factors in common, including political instability, population size, reliance on natural resources, but there are also significant differences. And for one thing, and this is really critical, wars are transformative. The root causes of a conflict may no longer pertain as a consequence of the changes that the conflict may have generated. For instance, population displacements or the rise of new political elites, which a civil war may have facilitated. I mean, think about the civil war in Afghanistan from 1989 to 1992. And how that facilitated the rise of fundamentalist Muslim forces, the Taliban, that in turn provoked a new civil war from 1992. They were not a factor in the equation, or certainly not to a very significant extent in that first period of civil war. So civil wars are transformative, and they may change conditions on the ground, and the as I said, the causes that were relevant at the outset may not be relevant later. Okay, so that's one approach that we can take. Another approach is to focus not on the causes of civil war, but on the causes of peace in the aftermath of civil war. In other words, what measures have been most successful in maintaining the peace after violent conflict, and have they been applied to the cases in question? Now, again, the range of possibilities and, surprise, surprise, the differences among scholars is considerable. So among the many things which scholars have stressed are the nature of the war termination. So, as I mentioned earlier, wars may end by military victory, negotiated settlement. They create different trajectories, let us say. Military victories tend to be more decisive. The total defeat of a rebel force, again, Sri Lanka is an example, tends to contribute to a lasting peace at great cost, it has to be said, as opposed to negotiated settlements. But negotiated settlements are, again, historically speaking, statistically speaking, more unstable. So one way, again, to approach this is to take into consideration the nature of the war termination and what implications that may have for the survival of peace. Another, third-party guarantees. So UN peacekeepers, NATO stabilization forces, scholars have found that these third parties, when present in a country, can help to stabilize, to help to secure the peace. There's a lot of debate over this, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they can make a contribution to the longevity of peace after conflict. Security sector reform. Scholars have also found that with, for instance, the professionalization of security forces, of the police, of the armed forces, the army, these can also contribute to longer lasting peace. And finally, but not lastly, there are many other factors that scholars have identified, but the nature of the political settlement itself, and in particular, how representative is it? How inclusive is it? Are there parties that are excluded? I mean, again, going back to the example of the Taliban were not invited to take part in the Bonn conference at which the government that has just been toppled in Afghanistan was established. The regime was established. It was thought that they were defeated decisively, and that they were inimical to democracy, or liberal democracy at least, and so they were not invited to take part. And whether it would have made a difference or not, we don't know, but certainly having been excluded, they were not satisfied with the settlement. So inclusiveness can also be a factor that contributes to the longevity of peace. But as I said, as with the previous approach, there's a lack of consensus among scholars as to the effects of these measures and which of these measures matter most. Now, there is growing recognition of the importance of monitoring the quality of peace and the progress of peace consolidation. And there's also recognition of the difficulty, among some scholars at least, of this, as is evident in this quotation. Monitoring the progress of peace is of such obvious value in any post-conflict society that the worth of doing so is rarely, if ever, challenged. However, the means used to do so is another matter. And this is, if you will, the quotation that inspires the work that I have done, that is reflected in the book that is the basis of this lecture. All right, so how do major peace-building actors then assess progress towards the achievement of a consolidated peace? We've established that it's extremely important given the trends, given the costs. So how do the actors that are involved in peace building, how do they assess progress towards the achievement of a consolidated peace? How do they know whether the peace that they're working to establish is a self-sustaining peace? And the fact is, they often don't monitor progress, or they don't do it well enough. Now, as I talk about the characteristics of assessment performed by these peace-building organizations, I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of exceptions. There are some notable exceptions to what I'm about to say. And in fact, as I said, I'm going to talk about some of those exceptions subsequently, the good practices, if you will. And there is growing awareness of the deficiencies of past and current practice. However, despite the notable exceptions and lots of finely worded documents, many of the following observations, in my view, remain valid. Now, to begin with, and here I've listed some of the shortcomings, if you will, characteristics and that are weaknesses of assessment. To begin with, rarely are peace-building organizations actually tasked with assessing the robustness of the peace that they're helping to build. And I call this strategic assessment as opposed to operational assessment. What they are tasked to do, quite a lot of, is reporting on developments in the field of operations. This is a widespread practice, but reporting itself is not the same as strategic assessment. Every head of a UN peacekeeping operation, for instance, submits formal periodic reports to the Secretary General on the situation in the country in question, often on a quarterly or semi-annual basis. And here you can see a Secretary General report on based on the reporting from the special representative in the field. The Secretary General, in turn, reports on the situation to the Security Council. Now, these reports vary in their content, but they typically provide an overview of the major developments since the last report, an evaluation of progress in the implementation of the mandate of the operation, and a discussion of the key challenges facing the country in the operation. Reporting has tended to be ad hoc and rather impressionistic. The UN Secretariat lacks a uniform understanding of the purpose of a field report and a Security Council briefing, and little guidance is provided in preparing them. Now, how do I know this? Because I've talked to many former special representatives of the Secretary General, and they all say the same thing. They get very, very little guidance on how to prepare the reports and on what would be useful content. There's also a tendency to measure what can be measured easily. Now, to give you an example, much easier to measure the number of training sessions on human rights that are organized for police officers, or the number of police officers that have undergone training. That's much easier to measure than the qualitative effects. How respectful are police of human rights? So in other words, outputs rather than outcomes. Outputs are a lot easier to measure than the actual outcome, the actual effect that it's having. Another problem, the focus tends to be on mandate implementation. Now that's reasonable. Peace operations have a mandate, and the authorizing body, in the case of the UN, the Security Council, wants to know whether the operation is implementing the mandate. But the problem is that the mandate does not always reflect the requirements for achieving a sustainable peace. If you look closely at how mandates are arrived at, they're often the fruits of political compromise between the states that are authorizing and frankly paying for the operation. So they don't always reflect the requirements for sustainable peace. And finally, a lot of the assessment is partial, not holistic. And partly that's a consequence of the multilateral engagement in peace operations, the fact that we have many organizations, some of them governmental, some of them non-governmental, and there's a certain division of labor. So in countries that have conflict-affected countries that have many organizations, many donor governments, many non-governmental organizations, they all have different responsibilities, and they're all concerned with their own patch, naturally. They are often reporting on their activities in relation to that particular area of responsibility that they've been assigned or they have if you will, appropriated to themselves, but not the broader strategic picture, as I said. So broadly speaking, in terms of the nature of the engagement of peace organizations, the concern is fundamentally about evaluating the performance of the operation, not with evaluating the quality of the peace that these operations are helping to produce. And it's really important to appreciate that fundamental difference. Now, as I said, I am generalizing. There are notable exceptions to these practices, and I'm just going to mention three. The first is the OSCE. The OSCE is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The OSCE, it's a regional organization, not, in other words. The OSCE has been at the forefront of peacebuilding organizations in developing a conflict analysis toolkit to assist the organization in analyzing emerging threats to the peace, including post-conflict peace, while at the same time identifying entry points for conflict prevention and the building of sustainable peace. Now, conflict prevention is a sensitive area for multilateral organizations because states are often wary of what they perceive to be meddling in their internal affairs, and they don't want to be put on any crisis watch lists. But the prevention of violent conflict is much less costly and often more effective than efforts to build peace after conflict. Now, what prompted the OSCE to sharpen its peace measuring capabilities was the 2008 Georgia crisis, which saw an escalation of tensions over the Georgian breakaway territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia culminate in a war between Georgia and Russia. And that crisis caught the OSCE off guard, and member states subsequently took the decision to strengthen the organization's capabilities along all phases of the conflict cycle, including in early warning and early action. And as a result, the OSCE developed and rolled out a conflict analysis toolkit and a set of early warning indicators for use in the organization's field operations. The toolkit and these indicators together provide a framework for the systematic analysis of conflict settings at the local, regional, national, and international levels, including, but not limited to, assessments of the robustness or fragility of the peace established in the aftermath of violent conflict. So precisely what we're looking at this morning. The framework that they developed stresses the importance of appreciating contextual issues, contextual factors, socioeconomic factors, political factors, in order to comprehend the specificities of a conflict, as well as the influence of the broader context and how that can exert an influence on conflict dynamics. So it's quite comprehensive. And by the OSCE's own reckoning, by its own account, in the first year since the introduction of the framework, that is to July 2013, the OSCE Secretary General, the head of the organization, raised concerns about what it called, in its words, worrying developments that threatened the peace, arising from this analysis on 11 occasions with respect to the OSCE region, the region in which it operates. And the OSCE's experience in Macedonia, what we now call North Macedonia, provides evidence of the effectiveness of these efforts. A combination of conflict analysis and early warning there alerted international officials to rising tension in the run-up to the December 2016 elections, when the ruling party sought to undercut its opponents through a combination of intimidation and coercion that was directed against opposition political parties, the media, and non-governmental organizations. And what the OSCE did is it produced a very trenchant analysis of the situation, which it shared with the European Commission, resulting in the Commission sounding the alarm in its November 2016 progress report, where it referred sharply to a political crisis in the country manifesting itself in, and I'm quoting from that report, state capture. Now, that's unusually harsh language for the EU, but it's reasonable to believe that without its intervention, without this early intervention, if you will, Macedonia might have succumbed to greater violence. Now, by contrast, East Timor, where the UN had an operation from 1999, in East Timor, it established a transitional administration, so quite a significant presence. In contrast to what I've just told you about the OSCE, in East Timor, there was no conflict analysis of any significant kind conducted in the entire time that the UN was present on the ground in East Timor. And what happened was that in 2006, there was a re-eruption of violence, which took parties by surprise, given the extent of UN involvement in that country. And a colleague of mine, Olav Ofstad, has written about this. And if I may, I'd like to just read what he says a good analysis of East Timor might have looked like, which, if undertaken, would have alerted authorities, international authorities, to the risk of conflict recurring. He says that such an analysis in the case of East Timor would have entailed a mapping of all existing conflicts and stakeholders, the threats they represented, the potential for new or changing conflicts, and the need for reconciliation and conflict resolution. To provide this, a profound understanding of East Timor's history was required, and of the connection between past and present conflicts. A thorough analysis of relations between different ethnic groups should have been a requirement, along with analysis of the relationship between political actors and different groups and actors in the informal sector, including the martial arts groups and gangs. The analysis would have needed to include socioeconomic, demographic, and psychological perspectives. A relevant conflict analysis must also take into account the likely effects of the peacebuilding process, as well as other trends and developments in society. Now, that may seem like a lot, and it is a lot, but it is certainly feasible. And it has been done in other countries. Conflict analysis along those lines has been performed. And as I said, to varying degrees, it's reflected in this now conflict analysis toolkit that's been adopted by the OSCE. So I want to highlight a second exception to the assessment, the characteristics of the assessment practices that I referred to earlier, and that is UN peacekeeping, benchmarking in the context of UN peace operations, peacekeeping, and actually peace building. Now, benchmarking has been used to very good effect by the UN to ascertain how well conflict-affected countries are able to maintain peace on their own without heavy lifting on the part of the international community. Benchmarking is a form of evaluation that uses specified standards of value, process, or state of affairs, the attainment of which, it's thought, contributes to the realization of an operation's broad objectives. So, for instance, the reduction and elimination of militia threats may be a benchmark for the establishment of a secure environment. And if done properly, benchmarking can introduce greater rigor and precision into assessments and allow for monitoring progress towards achieving a stable peace. Now, the UN mission in Sierra Leone, UNAMSIL it was called, established in October 1999 in the wake of an 8-year civil war there, it was the first UN peacekeeping mission to employ benchmarking to inform decision-making about troop drawdown. And the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers from Sierra Leone, the UN Secretary General decided in 2002, should be based primarily on, and now I'm quoting from his report, the government's capacity to maintain external and internal security without international assistance, which is, I would say, a reasonable standard for a sustainable peace. Now, here are the actual benchmarks that were specified by the Security Council for the UN peacekeeping operation. And these were drawn from the Lome and Abuja peace agreements, and they were identified by the architects of those agreements as elements that were key to the success of the peace process. Building up the capacity of the Sierra Leone police and army, professionalizing it, completing the reintegration of former combatants, very important not to leave them at large outside, consolidating the state's authority throughout the country, restoring effective government control over diamond mining. Again, I mentioned conflict diamonds earlier and how they were a factor in fueling the conflict, keeping it alive, and finally making significant progress towards the resolution of the conflict in neighboring Liberia, because these conflicts sometimes have a regional dimension. They often do, in fact. And so you have to pay attention as well to the regional aspects of the conflict. Now, the first of these benchmarks, building up the capacity of the Sierra Leone police and army, this entailed monitoring entailed tests conducted by the United Nations in every province of Sierra Leone to assess the readiness and the capacity of the government security forces to maintain peace and security independently. Now, imagine if that had been done for Afghanistan before the U.S. withdrawal. If that had been a requirement for the U.S. withdrawal, might have been a different outcome there. Satisfied with its state of readiness, UNAMSIL completed its withdrawal of troops at the end of 2005, and Sierra Leone has remained pretty much at peace ever since. Unfortunately, despite the proven utility of benchmarks and benchmarking, the Security Council's enthusiasm for it has declined in recent years. Now, I said if properly done, benchmarking can introduce greater rigor and precision into assessments of progress towards a stable peace, but benchmarking is not always done properly. And these are some of the common weaknesses. I already mentioned a tendency to measure what is easy to measure rather than what's meaningful to measure. As I said, inputs are a lot easier to measure than outcomes. So, to give you another example, the number of participants on human rights training programs rather than respect for human rights in practice. And an example of that would be how well do the courts function? How respectful of human rights are judges and the court system generally? Imagine what is required to evaluate their conduct. That's a much, much more difficult. Observing courts in action, reading decisions. That's much more difficult than it is to establish how many judges have had a certain kind of training for human rights. Okay, so that's one common weakness. Another is that benchmarks may be vague and unrealistic. In the case of the UN's monitoring and tracking mechanism of the strategic framework for peacebuilding in Burundi, which it adopted in 2007, a number of the benchmarks were vague. So, for instance, improvement of management of public resources, very vague formulation, but also unrealistic. Another example from that framework, the existence within 1 year of a political environment conducive to the peaceful resolution of political conflict. That's very unrealistic that within a year you can achieve such a, create such a political environment. Now, a further challenge for benchmarking is that the requirements for the sustainable peace, they may be difficult to ascertain. I mean, after all, these are complex and unique situations, and it may not be obvious what is required for a sustainable peace. And similarly, there may be differing interpretations of what's required. And also interpreting what has been achieved, what progress has been achieved, whether indeed benchmarks, indicators have actually been met. And moreover, with so much at stake, the continuation or the termination of a UN peacekeeping operation, most fundamentally, it can be difficult for a peacebuilding organization to ignore entirely political sensitivities of a host government or a leading troop or financial contributor in reporting on progress. If a country, if the government, host country wants to see an end to the operation, it will have a bearing on how it reports on conditions in the country. If it wants to see an end or continuation of the mission. Similarly, troop contributing countries may want to call it quits, and that may affect their views of the situation on the ground. So these are all common weaknesses of benchmarking. I just want to check the time. Okay, I think I'm in good time, but I think what I'll do is one more example of good practice, and then we'll move on. And what I want to bring to your attention now, the last exception to the, as you may recall, the general characteristics that I outlined at the beginning. And this one is ISAF. I just talked about Afghanistan. ISAF's strategic assessment. ISAF was the International Security Assistance Force, multinational military mission in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014. It was led by NATO from 2003. It was responsible initially for maintaining security in Kabul and the surrounding area, the capital, Kabul, and later for the provision and maintenance of security beyond the capital. ISAF was concerned with assessing progress in waging a counterinsurgency. Now, I acknowledge that's a far cry from measuring peace. And yet, I'd argue that the approach that ISAF took is worthy of consideration for the purpose of assessing progress towards achieving strategic goals, whether those goals are counterinsurgency or peace. I think that there are certain characteristics, which I'm going to identify in just a moment, which I think lend themselves to effective assessment of strategic goals. Now, ISAF adopted and discarded several assessment frameworks in the course of its short history, and I want to focus on one that it adopted in late 2011. The framework that ISAF adopted combined two things: evaluation of operational or campaign effectiveness on the one hand, and assessment of progress towards the achievement of strategic goals. And that's really important because, as I said earlier, organizations conduct a lot of operational evaluation, but very little strategic assessment. And this was a strength of the ISAF framework. The strategic assessment was derived from the campaign assessment. In other words, it was driven from the bottom up. Inputs came from ISAF's subordinate commands on the ground. These commands were thought to have the best visibility of conditions on the ground, since they were the ones who were conducting the operations. Now, how accurate their grasp of those conditions was is another matter. And we know that local knowledge on the part of NATO forces was often very limited. Another strength, however, of the ISAF framework was that it was broad, not narrow. in its scope. In assessing campaign effectiveness, it took into consideration not only security, but also governance, socioeconomics, and regional relations. So a little bit like what I had to say about the OSCE assessment framework in having a broader scope. Also, it was dynamic, the ISAF framework. It took account of whether the current situation represented an improvement or a deterioration in conditions relative to the last assessment. Now, here you see an assessment of one campaign task, and that task was to secure a particular area. It's represented in the form of a radar chart, which is what they used, which reflects the characteristics that I've just described. The assessment, you can see, has 4 dimensions to it: security, governance, socioeconomics, and regional relations. And the chart shows both progress and regress in relation to these 4 domains. Progress in the area of governance, but regress in the area of socioeconomic conditions. And in addition to the characteristics I've already noted about this framework, the assessment template, what you're looking at, also had a narrative section, you don't see it here, where justification for the levels chosen for each domain had to be provided. Also, there was an overall assessment section, and that wasn't just to summarize, but also as a space to identify major obstacles to future progress, key opportunities for ISAF to act on, and other major areas of interest. Now, on this slide, you see the standards or the assessment criteria that were used to plot this radar chart. And I've excerpted the standards in relation to 2 of the 4 domains, security and governance. Now, again, this is specifically in relation to the campaign task of securing a particular area. It's not an assessment of governance in general. I mean, look at, for instance, level 2 of governance. Some key government actors are present in area 2 or their actions are significantly undermining security. So it is an assessment of security, of governance, as it bears on security. And this was done with respect to each of the campaign tasks. Now here, this is going to be difficult to read perhaps, but I wanted to show you nonetheless, this is a composite response of 8 command assessments. So this would have been 1 command assessment. This would have been a composite of 8 assessments for 2 different areas, which is why you see divergent assessments. And you can also see the narrative section that I referred to earlier, which again, as I said, is a bit difficult to read perhaps. I'm just going to leave it on the screen so you can take it in if you'd like. As I said, these practices were employed to assess progress with respect to ISAF's campaign goals, not the strategic goals. To address that larger question of whether ISAF was achieving its overall strategic goals, ISAF developed a further assessment exercise. And for this purpose, ISAF generated a set of core strategic questions that it distributed to ISAF staff at various levels. And the aim was to use these questions to create a healthy tension within the ISAF staff that challenged the assumptions, that fostered new ideas, and that identified critical issues that required attention in the view of those being surveyed. And then ISAF senior staff discussed the responses to these strategic questions and used them as the basis for the production of a quarterly strategic assessment report. They also organized periodic commanders' assessment conferences for the presentation and discussion of these findings. Now, despite its apparent strengths, and I've been trying to highlight those, this assessment approach didn't survive for very long. What one analyst, one NATO analyst, explained to me, the narrative descriptive assessment was vulnerable to what we call cherry picking, selectively drawing on the findings in support of conclusions that more senior people wanted evidence for. In his view, the analyst with whom I spoke, the only way around this would have been independent assessment, because those who were making the ultimate assessment had certain interests in how that assessment was presented. And I'm going to come back to this problem in just a moment as I now talk about issues, a few issues that I want to highlight in measuring peace. And the first of those is, what do we measure? This is a very fundamental question. Now, the answer to that, of course, is peace. That's what we're measuring. But what is peace? It's a fundamental question, as I said. At the very least, it's the absence of armed conflict, what we sometimes call negative peace. But is that all peace is? Sometimes. That's the nature of the peace that we have, for instance, in Kosovo at the moment. Serbs and Albanians, Kosovo Serbs and Albanians are tolerate one another barely, you could say. There's a coexistence, there's a cold peace. Many would argue, however, that it's a weak peace, a deficient peace. And peace in this sense, peace understood as not war, conflates the character of peace as varied as the peace that prevails, for instance, in Sweden today, with that of North Korea. Both countries at present would qualify as states at peace by this very minimal measure. But the quality of peace in each case differs dramatically when one takes into consideration forms of violence other than armed conflict, such as torture or aggressive policing. So this goes back to what I said at the outset, that peace stability is one aspect of quality peace, but it is not the only aspect. Some would say that quality of peace exists only when there's mutual respect and fundamental goodwill between the relevant actors. Those can be identity groups within a country, those can be the government and its citizens. Some go even farther and say that peace only exists when all structural violence in a society has been eliminated. Institutionalized discrimination, when that's been eliminated, for instance. Now, how far do we go in defining peace? This has clear implications for how we measure peace. Now, related to this is that there are a lot of other conditions we can measure or try to measure that are cognates of peace. For instance, stability, security, resilience. They're not peace. They're not the same as peace, but they're closely related to peace. For example, when NATO deployed in Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1995 in support of implementing the military provisions of the peace accord, the Dayton Peace Accord, it wasn't the quality or the degree of peace that it sought to assess. Rather, it designed a diagnostic tool to measure what it called the return to normality. That was its language. And using a variety of everyday indicators of normality, such as the availability of food and goods, the level of prices, the occupancy and use of public and private buildings, ease of mobility. With these indicators in mind, NATO was concerned to assess progress towards achieving, in its words, sufficient stability in Bosnia and Herzegovina, not peace, sufficient stability. So that's the character of peace. What about the requirements of peace? What is peace, whatever it looks like, what does it require to survive and thrive? Now, another question, how do we measure peace in divided societies, in polarized societies? Different actors may hold different views about its meaning. The views of government elites may differ from those of rebel leaders. These various views don't necessarily exist in harmony. Indeed, they may be mutually exclusive, which makes the challenge of measuring peace in the aftermath of civil war all the more difficult. And there is, I think, a tendency to assume a certain harmony of interests among members of conflict-affected communities and a corresponding failure to appreciate that desiderata for peace, may not always be shared. I mean, for instance, how do you satisfy those who wish to live under strict religious rule and those who prefer a more liberal order? Compromise isn't always possible. Do you have Sharia law on alternate days of the week? Here's what one young Taliban fighter told the Financial Times earlier this week. The most important thing is the establishment of a pure Islamic regime. Okay, we can sit for talks about everything, but not about an Islamic regime. That's our red line. So measuring peace in polarized societies where you have different, as I said, desiderata is very difficult. Also, what happens when local preferences don't map onto international preferences? In Mostar, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and here you see the very famous Ottoman era bridge, or what was left of it, until it was further bombed and destroyed, where Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, and Bosnian Croats were on different sides, basically, of the city, divided by the river and the bridge. When the war ended, Muslims and Croats, who were now, as I said, living separately largely, they wanted separate power generation facilities for each community rather than a single unified power plant. They didn't want anything unified. The World Bank, which was financing the reconstruction, didn't object initially, but then it came under pressure from international critics who argued that such arrangements, if you establish such arrangements, they're going to further entrench ethnic division, even if it would contribute to building peace, but a negative peace, a cold peace. So how does one measure the quality of peace in such circumstances, and who decides? And finally, penultimately, I should say, another issue is the politicization of measurement. And I've already alluded to this when I was talking about ISAF and how senior US officials or NATO officials engaged in what we call cherry picking. But it's not a problem that's limited or was limited to ISAF or NATO. Even in the UN, the UNIVEM 2, the UN peacekeeping operation that was responsible for monitoring and verification of a ceasefire in Angola. In September 1992, there was a major violation of that ceasefire agreement, but that the violation, although reported to New York, to the Secretariat, was not conveyed to the Security Council, was not publicized by the Secretary General in his reporting on the progress of UNIVEM. And the reason for that, you could say it was a very good reason, was that negotiations between the government and the rebels were at a critical moment at that time. And it was thought that reporting on a major ceasefire violation would derail those negotiations. But nevertheless, I mean, it's just one example. You could say it's an example in the interest of a higher good, but nevertheless, it is another example of politicization of findings. And the last issue, again, I alluded to this in talking about ISAF in Afghanistan, but the critical importance of local knowledge, and the flip side of that is often the lack of local knowledge by internationals. And we've seen this across the globe, where whether it's peacekeepers or whether it's civilians who are, if you will, parachuted into situations where they don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they don't know the history. What they may be is experts in gender mainstreaming, or experts in various governance at a local level, local government, but they don't know the context in which they're operating. And as a consequence, they're often prone to misjudgment. They're not as effective as they could be, arguably, if they did have that. Now, I want to close. I recognize I'm coming up to the end of the time available to me, but fortunately, that coincides with the end of my slides almost. So in closing, I just want to highlight what has been perhaps implicit in some of the things that I've been saying, a few principles of good practice. And the first of these is what I call an ethnographic approach. Now, some of you may have read another excellent book, Séverine Autesserre, called Peaceland. She talks about an ethnographic approach that she took by embedding herself in the peacebuilding organizations that she was studying. I use the term differently. I use it to refer for purposes of strategic assessment. An ethnographic approach would favor greater reliance on knowledge of, just as I've been saying, local culture, local history, and especially the particular conflict dynamics at work in a given conflict, including at the micro level. So an ethnographic approach is, in my view, extremely important for effective assessment. Another principle of good practice is continual reassessment, strategic reassessment. Do the original objectives still support the broad strategic goals of the peacebuilding operation? Have new or unanticipated threats or impediments to a stable peace emerged? For instance, external security challenges or inauspicious political shifts that might require the articulation of new or altered objectives? Has available implementing capacity internationally and nationally changed? And what implications does this have for meeting an operations objectives and achieving a sustainable exit? And finally, the importance of incorporating local perspectives. Now, you're going to be hearing from, among others, Pamina Furcho this afternoon, where she'll be talking a lot about this. But it's extremely important that the peace that's being built is the people's peace, if you will, a peace that is appropriate for conflict-affected populations, bearing in mind, however, what I said earlier about polarized communities and the difficulty of assuming, if you will, one size fits all, even within a small community where there may be differences. So just to conclude, a couple of other points I want to make. Strategic assessment is not merely a technical exercise. There may be technical dimensions to it, certainly. Professionalization of the security forces, for instance, is something, if you will, that can be assessed in a rather technical way. But what is peace? Who decides what is peace? These are not technical questions. These are fundamental, normative, political questions. And finally, strategic assessment, extremely important, is not, however, a panacea. And for a couple of reasons. For one thing, conflicts are hugely complex, and there may be limits to how well we can understand their dynamics, even those who understand the dynamics extremely well. And this is what social scientists call bounded rationality. There's a limit to what we can know. And also, finally, at the end of the day, politics will often trump other considerations, including how important sustainable peace is for the purpose of mission closure. You would think that it is the most important consideration. But again, as we saw in Afghanistan with the withdrawal of US forces there, it was not the driving consideration. It was the termination of US engagement in that particular conflict. And we've seen that again and again in other contexts, and also a decision for other political reasons, sometimes even budgetary concerns, to bring an end to operations. The sustainability of the peace, important though it is not always the overriding consideration. So I want to close with the question that I opened with. Can we know that the peace that's been established following a civil war is a stable peace? Well, I'm afraid the answer is no, but it is possible to ascertain the quality of a peace and the vulnerability of that peace to conflict relapse with higher levels of confidence. So thank you for your attention, And I hope that that has been useful and interesting. And I hope I'm on time.
You're perfectly on time. Thanks a lot, Richard, for this wonderful lecture that really brought us from the causes of peace and wars and the difficulties to draw a line between the two, and really the kaleidoscopic perspective we can have on peace and how many things deal with definition, with what we understand with peace and the implementation of that, and all the difficulties with benchmarks. On a personal note, I found fascinating how in all these discourse, and this goes a bit back to my expertise that is mostly with democratic transition. I mean, all the time you mentioned peace, I could have mentioned democracy, right? And difficulties of assessing democracy, measuring democracy.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating for me to see this kind of linkages. And you also mentioned Severino Tesser. Severino Tesser has been our guest at the Masterclass 2 years ago, also with Michael Doyle. And actually many of the suggestions you were having also, popped to my mind many questions concerning democratic peace theories, and probably would be a question I would like to ask. I mean, it seems a bit, less under the spotlight right now, this kind of discourse, but still, I think that any democratic peace building process is still inconceivable with all the problematic that goes with it. I think it's highly problematic without also elections, with also this kind of model. And maybe this would be my first question for you, and how this can be a problem sometimes also in polarized society, or what is your first reaction in this sense? But I also want to give maybe the floor to the students. We can collect a couple of questions and give you more time to react. So who would like to start?
I may start, maybe?
Margot, yes, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Professor Kaplan, for your time and your lecture. It was intellectual nourishment, really. So there is one particular point which triggered my attention during your presentation. It is the point on good practices. We clearly understand that there is a need to take into consideration indicators which would be more inclusive, actually. And that's why we observe more and more approaches, as you mentioned, ethnographic approach, the fact that we take into consideration more local practices. And so my first question would be, how are designed or how are decided the indicators that are considered more inclusive, and how do they take into consideration also societal or cultural differences between members of a community itself? And I have a second question, which is quite linked to the first one. That's why I will allow myself to ask it now, but it's a bit more theoretical. I was just thinking that one could totally imagine that if we take into consideration local perspectives, there may be a risk of a much more divided or polarized world. And so my question would be, do you think that a balance could be found, and that such a balance could be effective between the will of a universal way of measuring peace and the consideration of local perspectives, that such a balance could lead to maybe what I would call a pluralistic peace, which would take into consideration many different indicators? Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. Very, very good question. So one thing I should clarify is that I am not a practitioner, so I haven't been involved directly in drawing up, for instance, indicators. I haven't sat in on meetings where it's been discussed or decided, although I have observed. So I'm a bit of a fly on the wall, not in the actual sessions at which these meetings are undertaken. But all I can say, and please tell me if I'm not answering your question directly enough, I think it is important to recognize that there's been a learning curve with regard to indicators. I think that at about 2007, 2008 is when the Peacebuilding Support Office, which is the secretariat of the Peacebuilding Commission, woke up to this challenge that I mentioned about, we've got these countries on the agenda. How do we know when it's appropriate for them to come off? And that's when they first began to think in terms of benchmarking. The irony is that it was actually the then Department of Peacekeeping Operations which introduced benchmarking before the Peacebuilding Support Office did, and they began to introduce them in their peacekeeping operations. But you were interested specifically in inclusivity, and it's a really hard question. I mean, it relates, I think, when Valentina was saying how this has parallels with other aspects of peace building. It's also relevant to peacemaking. I mean, who do you invite to the table, for instance? And we would often like to exclude, for instance, warlords, because we think that they're not positive forces in society, and yet to exclude them, may result in creating difficulties for us later, because they will be arguably spoilers, or they may become spoilers. To include them, however, means that they will have an influence on some very, very critical decisions that will be taken. Now, that's one form of inclusivity. There are other aspects of inclusivity, for instance, with respect to gender. And very often, there's a lot of research that's been done that suggests that greater participation of women in various aspects of peace building, peacemaking, can be very positive, but there's a lot of resistance to that. And I even observed this. I was in Timor when the United Nations was there, and I went with World Bank, actually Asian Development Bank representatives into the countryside to attend a local meeting of a village to decide on, as part of a community empowerment program, to decide on how they were going to use little grants of money. They were required to have equal numbers of men and women, but the men were the only ones who did the talking. And you got the sense that this was something that was normatively uncomfortable for them in a way. How do you deal with that? Do you say, okay, they'll get used to it, they'll learn? Or do you say it's premature? They need a kind of acculturation. And then, you should even ask yourself, is this the right thing to be doing at all? Maybe they have their own norms, and we may not always like them, or we may not, think so highly of them, but maybe they work better for them. Very hard questions. And I'm great at asking the questions. I'm terrible at answering them when it comes to these sorts of things. And you ask another really interesting question about this balance. Balance of all kinds is arguably attractive in the abstract, but very, very difficult sometimes to achieve practically. And I gave you that example of Mostar and the bank, that was a very special case, because the bank wished to avoid any political decision making, if you will. They have explained that we don't. Our articles of agreement make it very clear we don't engage in politics, and they felt that this was an engagement in politics. But they, as I said, came under pressure to relent, and ultimately they did put pressure on the two sides to agree to a unified power generation plant, which is, I think, what they ended up with in the end. But in so many other respects, it remains a divided city. It's always a question, how much do you yield to those local desires, their desiderata, as I put it, and how much you try to transform. Knowing that some of those impulses locally are actually responsible for creating and maybe furthering the conflict. And it's a really hard question, to know the limits. We, from the outside, think transformation is required. Are we the right agents to do it? Bosnia and Herzegovina today remains highly dependent on an international presence. And indeed, many people use it as an example to ask, is it really such a good thing for us to be so heavily involved sometimes because they, if we were to leave tomorrow, I wouldn't say there'd be necessarily a resumption of war, but I wouldn't be surprised if there would be a referendum by Republika Srpska on separation, which would go against all the fundamental tenets of the peace accord. So, these are very, very hard questions that confront the international community. And again, a point I just want to emphasize before I close, a bit long-winded with my response, is that it's really important to be context-specific. Yes, we need general guidelines and principles of engagement, but we also have to be attuned to what the parameters of a given conflict situation, what the conditions allow there for us to do and not to do. And sometimes you scope to be more transformative. There have been cases where, very, very significant change has been introduced to very good effect. But there are other cases where, for various reasons, and Afghanistan is the prime example, and maybe you could say it was because it was implemented poorly, but maybe there was also problems with a lot of the conceptualization of the engagement, design and conceptualization. So I hope that helps a little bit anyway. I think I may have introduced more questions than answers to your question.
It does. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I can't see the questions. There are. I'm going to count on you, Valentine, if you don't mind.
Sure. But I think we have still a couple of more questions from the panelists,
yeah,
right?
Sure.
Leah?
So thank you very much for your intervention. It was really interesting and absolutely fascinating, to be honest. The thing is, my question, I will cheat also because I have two questions, in fact. So the first one is, because you said you were not a practitioner, but I would like to know in which dimension your analysis, your perspectives can help the UN in its mission of peace building and its crisis management mission, in fact. And my other question is more like, it's something quite specific. It's about the narrow mandate of the peacekeepers of the UN. Do you consider that this kind of tools is a way to go towards or backwards peace?
So the latter question, can you hear me, by the way? I've taken off the headset and because it's easier for me to hear you. The latter question regarding the mandate, I didn't quite understand.
The second one is about, like, I know the UN peacekeepers do have a specific mandate, a very narrow mandate. And my question is that tool goes towards or backwards the peace, in fact?
Okay, so with regard to your first question, I think that the UN welcomes the kind of independent, disinterested analysis that scholars can bring to the work that they do. And I personally have benefited enormously from, over the years, lots of engagement and a mutual exchange of knowledge, insights. I learn about what the thinking and practices are within the organization, and in turn, I hope they gain also from my insights of my colleagues. But I know that the UN is not alone in this regard. I mean, I think that that's true to more or less degrees with other organizations as well. And I think there's an openness on both sides. Unfortunately, anybody who works in the UN can tell you they don't have time, to read long studies. Indeed, they often don't have time to read their own reports. I remember asking somebody about his contribution to a report, to which I know he contributed, about the report itself. And he said, I've got it on my shelf, but I've never even read it because they're just so often busy. But I think over the years, again, there's been greater openness. Again, not just at the UN. On your question about the mandate, I'm not sure I would agree entirely with the premises. I think that we've seen both a contraction and expansion. I mean, one thing that is part and parcel now of every peacekeeping mandate is protection of civilians. And that is new. That emerges, I think, from tendency, the trend that's reflected also in the responsibility to protect norm. We didn't have that in the past, and it's an enormous responsibility, actually. Indeed, I've sometimes thought an excessive burden, because it's not always possible for the UN to implement such an ambitious mandate. But there is also truth to what you say, insofar as I think the appetite in the United Nations for these kind of large missions, certainly the transitional administrations that we saw, Kosovo, Timor, but even, Democratic Republic of Congo, yes, we're there now, but there's a lot of pressure on the UN by its member states, especially the permanent 5 members, but not only, to scale back. And that's why you saw in that slide I showed you about expenditure, declining costs. I mean, we've gone down more than $1 billion in expenditure for peacekeeping. And I think that reflects this desire on the part of member states to scale back. Under the Trump administration, there was tremendous pressure to do just that. And I thought, well, that's not going to be very well received by other member states who recognize the important role of the United Nations. But in fact, it was a shared concern. It wasn't just Trump and the Trump administration, but there were other states, France also, wanting to see scaling back of the UN in this area. But the bottom line, I guess I'd say, is the most important thing is that the mandate's appropriate to the situation. But as I said before, mandates are political compromises, and sometimes they represent a kind of we say playing to the audience. It can be, and I don't want to be too harsh in using this language, but it can be a form of posturing by member states who have to be seen to be doing something, but not necessarily doing what many people would say is the most effective form of engagement. So that's why you end up sometimes with a more narrow, if you will, mandate, where there's a recognition of so much more that needs to be done, but an unwillingness to do more for various reasons.
Thanks, Richard. Rachel, perhaps the last from the panelists, and then we start to collect. We have a few on the Q&A.
So yes, so first of all, I wanted to thank you for this presentation. That was very, very, very interesting.
Thank you.
So for me, my question was about more the peace indicators. I found that very interesting, but what I wanted to know was in what measures can we say that, how do I say that, like sociologically, the economics, the fact that some countries are like selling arms or participate in brokering the peace, can be an indicator that the peace isn't achieved, even if you said that when there hasn't been conflict for 1 year, we can talk of peace. But what about economics indicator that continue even after the peace is achieved? Can we talk then about peace not achieved, or indication measures that peace could be broken again?
Now, let me just get clarification from you. Are you talking about countries that conflict-affected countries that are selling arms, or are you talking about arms suppliers which are not themselves in conflict? So,
yes, arms suppliers that are not themselves in conflict have them a responsibility in the threaten and they threaten peace, and it is an indicator to say that in a said area the conflict is not over and peace is not achieved yet.
Right. Okay. Well, that's very interesting, because your question correctly, I think, reflects the fact that peace in a country that's experienced violent conflict may be fragile, in part because of the wide availability of arms circulating that can be used to equip or re-equip rebel forces and give rise, consequently, to renewed fighting. And it is also true that the very same countries that are engaged in efforts to bring peace to a conflict-affected country are themselves responsible for often the sale of arms, small arms and others that are, if you will, undermining peace, not necessarily in that country. I mean, I hope for the most part they're not so cynical as to sell arms to the rebels in a country whose peace they're trying to consolidate. Although I'd have to think a little bit, I wouldn't be surprised if there have been such cases. Maybe I'll get an email from somebody later who tells me of such a case. But there is no question that they are at one and the same time often trying to contribute to building peace and at the same time, in other respects, undermining peace. And I think, I don't know if Diego is with us still, but CIPRI does a really good job of monitoring, and also Geneva, the small arms weapons project, very good job of monitoring the sale, distribution of small arms, small and light arms. And these are the arms that are really most responsible for undermining peace in countries where peace is very fragile. So yes, I think you're right that it is a factor, a relevant factor anyway, for the maintenance of peace internationally, if that helps.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, Richard. I would collect a couple of questions we have in the Q&A. So the first is from Kinshasa. So there is Moise Kitete, president of BPD NGO from Congo, Kinshasa. The question is, peace actors see reconciliation as a multidimensional process of overcoming social, political, and religious divides, repair and transformation of relationship, heal the physical and psychological wounds of civil war, as well as deal with and address historical wrongs, including structural causes of conflict. Do you think that this can be possible in the case of the conflict which are tearing in the region of the Grand Lac apart, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where transitional justice is advocated?
Okay, I have that question before me. I just want to take another look at the
Sure, you see it?
premise. Yeah, a multidimensional process of overcoming social, political, right? Okay, so what I hesitate to do is to weigh in on specifically the DRC, the Great Lakes situation, because I am not well enough informed to be able to speak to that conflict situation. But in principle, I think that all conflicts are amenable to resolution, a resolution which, however, in some cases will require, most cases, compromise, in some cases even a sacrifice of critical, strongly held political goals and other goals. But I do see even historically, if we look at some of the worst conflicts, the most, if you will, damaging conflicts, we can see that there has been healing and reconciliation, a transformation of relationships. As I said, even in cases where it has been thought that it might not be possible. I mean, at the same time, we've also seen enduring problems between parties where the repair has been very slow or arguably even non-existent. But I do think that there is considerable scope for reconciliation and repair, transformation of relationships, even in cases which would seem to be impervious to such efforts. And it's hard for me to comment specifically on the DRC, but I don't see any reason why that should be an exception. Now, the question is, what role can transitional justice play in those cases? And, again, I leave this to experts on transitional justice because it can take many different forms. The nature, administration of that transitional justice can be punitive. It can be restorative. These are not mutually exclusive, but there are various ways in which transitional justice can be administered, including also, obviously, traditional ways. What is most appropriate in any given situation is going to vary from case to case, I would say. But there is, I think, an important role for transitional justice in reconciliation and the transformation of relationships. That was a very vague response on my part, I recognize.
Question. We have two questions that are related. Actually, one from Nancy, not Morgan, that appears on the screen. So Nancy asks, thank you, Professor Kaplan, for your amazing presentation. Do you think nowadays state building strategies should follow the path of Peacebuilding's good practice principle, namely on ethnic approach? And I think this is related to the second one, Ayrton Aubry. But also thanks very much for the talk and say that builds on the question of Nancy. It seems that international actors have much difficulties to consider local perspective that contradicts their own thoughts. For instance, France stopped for a few days its cooperation with Malian authorities because they engaged discussion with doctors considered as too religious by France. On this point, the gap between scholars and international actors seems to widen, but do you observe it as well? And what could be the solution? Also, local actor is usually very loosely defined. Would you know of a practical and more precise definition of the term?
Wow, nobody's asking easy questions. Everybody's asking very difficult questions. And yes, they are both related. I'm trying to go back to Nancy's question. I don't understand quite the ethnic approach. So do you think nowadays state building strategies should follow the path of peace building's good practice principle, namely an ethnic approach?
Noemi, do you want to give the floor to Nancy or Margot? I don't know if she can maybe explain better on the micro.
Yes.
Now I know who should give.
I can try to.
No, Margot, sorry, Morgan, not Margot.
Oh, sorry.
Because it's Morgan.
Is Nancy.
Like Nancy. Or if Nancy, you want to text maybe on the chat, because since there is this problem with the name, maybe we cannot give you the right number. But maybe you can text, and in the meantime, you can reply to Ayrton.
Yeah.
There is too much Morgan.
Yeah, there are many Morgan for some reason.
Yeah. Okay. Local perspectives. This is a challenge. I agree. It goes back to the point that I was making before about, in a way, who should sit at the table, whose views and preferences should be reflected in, for instance, the design of constitutions, the character of a state. We see that now very, very clearly. Again, I keep going back to Afghanistan because it's so much in evidence at the moment, but you have a real clash of cultures at the moment. A more radical Islamic perspective, and that's a bona fide local perspective that is clashing with a more, I don't know how, not necessarily secular, but somewhat more cosmopolitan, also local perspective. And they are, to some extent, mutually exclusive. And so, it's very, very difficult to see how adoption of principles reflecting the preferences of one set of actors or another are not going to be seen as unacceptable by the other party. Unless there is a recognition that these are mutually exclusive, and a respect requires that we allow for the practice of our religion and principles, provided that it doesn't encroach on those who don't share those principles. But to radical Islamists, that's not acceptable. It's not just in Afghanistan. I was tempted to upload a photograph of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem who regularly attack women, stone them, who are, in their view, immodestly dressed, who are not religious. They feel that even their exposure and their presence is an assault. And how you sort of cultivate mutual respect in those circumstances is very, very difficult to achieve. I don't have an easy answer for that. But I accept, yes, local actors is very loosely defined. And maybe that's just as well, because it allows us to accommodate a wide range of possibilities. I'm not aware of a practical, more precise definition of them. But I guess I think that at least two considerations should be on the minds of peace builders, and that is, do they represent a significant component of the population, which should not be excluded? And would their exclusion from consideration, from participation, arguably, possibly undermine the effectiveness of efforts to build peace? So I think that those are two important considerations that should perhaps influence decisions about who should be seated at the table. But I think it's actually better to work with a loose definition of local actors to, again, be able to accommodate individuals, groups that don't conform to a standard definition.
Wonderful. So the last two questions, we have Nancy that specified a bit better the ethnic approaches. Did Professor Kaplan think that the principle of peacemaking policies, namely on ethnic perspective, are transposable to state building policies? This was the meaning of my question. And then we have Claire-Marie Beillet, that is a former student of the Master in Human Rights, Security and Development, and now is Osce officer. Good morning, sir. First of all, thank you very much for your intervention and the explanations provided. Following the answer previously given, in your opinion, which non-warring norms and values should prevail in peace benchmarking, especially when peace system outcomes is assessed through machine learning? Thank you.
Okay, wow, very difficult questions again. So again, I hope, Nancy, that I'm going to be interpreting your question correctly. But I do think that peacemakers, peace builders are sensitive to the salience of ethnicity, and they do not ignore or fail to take into consideration. I suppose the question is whether, to what extent they should do this and to what extent they should seek to downplay, if you will, the importance and salience of ethnicity. I mean, one of the criticisms of the international efforts in Bosnia and Herzegovina is that, going back to the Dayton Peace Accord that brought an end to the war, that it entrenched ethnic differences. That's what many people have argued. And indeed, it was for a long time the case that you could only be president and even occupy other higher offices by the Constitution if you were ethnic Croat, Muslim, Bosniak, or Serb. That was enshrined in the Constitution. And that was deemed by the European Court of Human Rights, if I'm not mistaken, to be a violation, probably Valentina, you know this better than I do, of human rights. And so the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina mandated that changes be made, but they have not been made. But you could say that for this reason, those who designed the Dayton Agreement, and that include the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, were, if you will, handmaidens to an ethnic approach. They employed an ethnic approach which has perpetuated ethnic differences. But, you know, sometimes you have to take these realities, if you will, embrace them and try maybe to transform them, to hope that with the passage of time, they become less important. But if you ignore them altogether, you are at risk of creating institutions that are not institutions with which the members of that society can identify. So that is, I think, the trade-off with the two. And sorry, I've lost the question from the representative of Osce, but it was about
machine learning. Yeah, it's in the answer already, actually. So following the answer previously given, which non-warring norms and values should prevail in peace benchmarking, especially when peace systems outcomes is assessed through machine learning? Thanks.
Well, machine learning is really interesting. I'm not as well informed, I think, about the prospects for machine learning in a different context, and that's with the analysis of conflict dynamics. I think that the United Nations and other organizations in the past have been hindered by the fact that they have sometimes had a lot of data and have not had the capacity to analyze it well enough, swiftly enough. And machine learning is opening up possibilities for doing just that. I'm not at all aware of efforts to employ machine learning for the purpose of the design of indicators, although I guess to the extent that indicators should reflect the nature of the conflict dynamics and the nature of the challenges to building peace, machine learning could be useful in that regard. But if, was it Marie, what was the person's name who asked the question?
Claire Marie.
Claire Marie. If she wishes to email me anything that is relevant to this, I'd be very happy to look at it, because I'm not aware, as I said, of the use of machine learning for this purpose, but anything, whether in English or French, that she may have come across that is the basis for the question, I'd be very interested to educate myself, and maybe I could respond more fully.
Wonderful. So thank you very much. We're also perfectly on time. Warm thanks to Professor Richard Kaplan for having been with us this morning. It's been insightful. We learned a lot, and this has been a wonderful beginning for also the Measuring Peace Day. And we will continue the conversation in the afternoon, and the quantitative studies will reemerge as really the last question already suggested. So thank you very much to all. I also bring a warm thank you from Professor Ioannis Panoussis, our dean, that really wanted to be with us this morning, but unfortunately he could not, but really recommended to bring his greeting to Professor Kaplan and to all the participants. And I just tell you, let's have a break and let's continue at 2 o'clock. So thanks a lot to all.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you today.
Great pleasure, Richard. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.